Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We're back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right on back into it. First, we have Trump on deploying the National Guard to Chicago. I have the right to do anything I want to. I'm the president of the United States. If I think our country is in danger, and it is in danger in these cities, I can do it. Posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit, and looks like it's a link to a video of him saying just that quote. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't think that's correct. I don't think just because someone who's in a position of power says something doesn't mean they can just do it. But in practice, what Trump is 100% correct here. When it comes to government, a lot of people will refer to the federal government, and when it comes to the federal government, a lot of people will refer to whatever the executive branch says. And since he's the leader of the executive branch right now, he pretty much can do whatever he wants to. And ultimately, there's nothing you can do about. There's nothing if you can do about it if you don't like it. Because that's a big problem for the government having the legal monopoly of force. Sometimes the leader of the government who has that access to that monopoly on legal use of force can justify doing whatever you want to, even if you think he's the worst person ever. And yeah, I personally don't care for it, but that's just ultimately the nature of power. It's like Michael Malice says, power is whatever those in charge say it is. And Donald Trump knows that, and he very much what he's doing. And yeah, I personally don't care for it, but I'm sure that if he had a D next to his name, Reddit would say he's completely justified. But they only don't care about him because he has the R next to his name, and because Reddit's whole political philosophy at this point, I would argue its whole life philosophy at this point. It's even on the non-political subreddits. It's always orange man bad. It's been that way for like 10 years now. And yeah, I personally don't care for the guy, but I think you should have more of a philosophy on life than just orange man bad. But teach their own, I guess. Then we have DC National Guard picking up trash, posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the military subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the National Guard stuff in the cities is all just pretty performative, and this is a good example of that. Donald Trump might tweet, "Oh, crimes down the X amount," but ultimately, I think it's all just for show. And that's a lot of politics. Is pretty much performative. It's pretty much just theaters. It's pretty much Washington D.C. is pretty much Hollywood East at this point. And yeah, it gets tiring after a while. But yeah, personally, I don't really care for how he called the National Guard into the cities. But it's just really more of a performative thing than anything else. And this is a good example of that, they really don't seem to have anything to do other than pick up trash or just stand around the National Mall all day. At least most of them, it does seem like that. Maybe not all of them. Maybe there are a few who are stopping crime, I don't know. But they mostly just seem to be standing around and picking up trash. Then we have Trump says he can do anything he wants from dailycost.com, posted by EmptyRow5585. And yeah, we talked about this in an earlier post, but yeah, in practice, he can pretty much do whatever he wants, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. I'm sure that when Reddit hates this, but they'll become pro-fascism again the second the Blue Party takes back the reins of the state, and they'll it's like they say, "Oh, we're anti-authoritarian, no kings." But you were completely fine when Joe Biden was the king, but now that Donald Trump says he's the king, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you, a lot of people, they don't have principles; they just want a dictator they agree with. Then we have Trending on All, posted by Help of Eating. Trump said today, and that's cross from the Oscar subreddit. Trump said today, "I have the right to do anything I want to. I'm the president of the United States. People think it's weird or false on this." And yeah, that's the same post again. And yeah, it's Reddit will take whatever bait Trump puts out. He always says an outrageous statement to get people's attention. And then Reddit just constantly talks about it for a day, and then they move on to the next whatever ridiculous statement he says. And eventually get tired of it after a while, but Reddit will keep taking the bait every single time. Then we have Homie Thinking We're All Immature, and that looks like posted by Hexus Pinata, and that looks like a post from a Twitter feed. Stop complaining about your life. There are literally people stuck in the libertarian phase. And then another guy replied because of a picture because it's awesome. And yeah, I'd agree with that. I personally think I was kind of reluctant to have a libertarian phase because, libertarians are usually seen as being a childish or teenager thing. But, ultimately, I think the libertarian position is, you could argue that, that's kind of the innate position of humanity that you would get to develop as a child or teenager, that everyone should be as free as possible as long as they're not hurting anyone else. That might seem kind of a childish philosophy, but just because it's childish doesn't mean it isn't true. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have additional measures to address the crime emergency in the District of Columbia from whitehouse.gov, posted by Doctor Who 07. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for, the crime, but, I don't think the state should be the one handling it. I think it should be private militias rather than a public militia like the National Guard. And yeah, I think DC, you do need to have people fix up the cities, but the way to do that isn't with the state, it's through private individuals and private enterprise rather than state individuals and state enterprise. And that's pretty much, I would say, argues the libertarian position. Then we have Trump orders Hexit to form National Guard unit in each state to combat protest. Order also calls for creation of an online vigilante portal to be deputized for the purpose, from Stripes.com, posted by Swampinky Dan, and that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care. I think that's, I still think the state's too involved, but I do like the idea of the online vigilante portal. I do think, but if the state's running it, it's not vigilantism. Vigilantism is justice that is done in spite of the state, not because of it. And yeah, I personally wouldn't call it an online vigilante portal, but Reddit, they always want to throw how Trump's this guy who wants to authoritarian, but vigilantism I think is kind of innately an anti-authoritarianism. But regardless, I definitely do think it's pretty much just whatever with the current, it's all the same headlines pretty much. Eventually you get tired of seeing the same headlines, but you have to call them out that this on it, I would say. And yeah, I think, maybe instead of an online, a government-run vigilante portal, we have just, I think we already have enough stuff you can pretty much do the same thing on. You can do that like on Reddit, Facebook, X, you pretty have all the social media networks, and you can create your own website as well. It might cost money in some instances if you did for a host URL, but there are a lot of free ways to get this one as well. So, ultimately, I don't think the government should be running any websites. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have MAGA puts Wikipedia in its crosshairs. Prominent Republicans are trying to fight bias online, from Gizmodo.com, posted by Donald Key. And that's a cross post from the technology subreddit. And yeah, I personally don't care too much for Wikipedia. I've edited it quite a bit, but it's definitely biased. I would agree with them on that. But the big reason that that MAGA is coming after right now is because Israel told them to, and that's that's a lot of what MAGA does, is justifying it because Israel says to. That's why they wanted to ban TikTok for a while, because Israel wanted it banned. But regardless, personally, I don't really care for, I do think Wikipedia is biased, but, Wikipedia is a private company. It's not government run, so it should be allowed to be biased. Everything's going to be biased to some extent. So, I personally don't really care for Wikipedia or its bias. I definitely do think it's kind of a DNC circle jerk. Not as bad as something like MSNBC or Reddit, but it's definitely kind of up there. But regardless, if you don't like Wikipedia, just ignore it. And that's the same thing with everything else. If you don't like MSNBC or Reddit, you're free to just ignore them. They might influence other people to do things that you don't like, but as long as you're not forced to interact with them, the libertarian position is you can do whatever you want to. Then we have "We Live in a Fascist Nation, Now What" by Chris Armitage from dailycost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they had a pretty interesting read. And yeah, personally, I would argue that the U.S. has been a fascist nation since at least World War II, maybe even the Civil War. But regardless, Reddit only says fascism when Trump does it. They used to say it was fascist when Bush does it. Now they say they pretty much rehabilitated him because he's not the orange man, and that's going to be like after Trump. They'll go, the next guy's so much worse. He's the fascist. Trump wasn't really a fascist by comparison. And yeah, personally, that's why I don't really care for Reddit. They'll just follow whatever the narrative is, and they say fascist like it's the word the, it's like it's one of the only words they know how to use, and it gets tiresome after a while. If you want to call Trump a fascist, that's fine, but it's like the boy who cried wolf or Chicken Little, when you always go yell you're being attacked by a wolf or that the sky is falling. Eventually, people are going to stop listening, even if it does happen. So if you want to call something a fascist or a Nazi or Hitler, that's fine. But eventually people will just start toning it out. And when you pump out articles like when you see this article for like the 50,000th time, eventually you just stop caring. And that's what I think Reddit is pretty much doing at this point. They've driven the stuff, the sick stone to the ground. It's bare, you can't even see it anymore. Next, we have January 6th rioter Ashley Babbitt to receive military funeral honors from HuffPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, "This is disgraceful." And yeah, I don't really care for Ashley Babbitt. I do think she probably shouldn't have been there in the first place, but ultimately, they killed her. And regardless, I'm pretty sure that it's very much I see a lot of parallels between her and George Floyd. George Floyd he might have died anyway, but the state acted heinously to him and with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck, and then Ashley Babbitt did the state officials acted heinously to her when they shot her. But it just shows you how differently they're viewed. George Floyd, if he got buried with full military honors, Reddit would be all over it. Or I'm pretty sure if Ashley Babbitt, if it was Kamala saying storm the Capitol and Ashley Babbitt died during that, they'd be completely fine with it. But it just goes to show you we've become so polarized as a society. It's like, what is a martyr to the woke leftist? George Floyd is a martyr. To the MAGA rightist, Ashley Babbitt is a martyr. Our society is so polarized right now. It's just people only care about whatever their narratives are. And yeah, it just really, it doesn't really matter who does something anymore, or what people do anymore. It matters who does it. I'm sure if Ashley Babbitt was a member of the in-group rather than the out-group, Reddit would be all over this. Same for a lot of people on the right and George Floyd. And that just goes to show you, a lot of people don't have principles. They only have teams, and they'll follow whatever the current narrative is. Even if it's something they don't usually support. Like, a lot of people on the right say law and order, but Ashley Babbitt stormed the Capitol, and that doesn't sound very law and order some. And yeah, it just goes, people will follow the narrative. Everyone says they're a free thinker, but then the narrative comes knocking at the door, and suddenly they'll just do whatever it says. Then next we have literally caught on tape. CNN drops Trump's actual conversation with Governor Wes Moore, and it's absolutely nothing like you remembered, from AtlantaBlackStar.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's crossed from the No Shit Sherlock subreddit. And yeah, this is Reddit headline, pretty much infinity. We finally got Trump in the lie this time, where he's gonna fall any day now. And eventually, you start toning it out. Trump's a liar, but all politicians really are. But Reddit only seems to care that Trump is. They don't care. They don't hold anyone to the same account as him. They ran defense for Joe Biden for his whole term, but the second a member of the out-group takes power like Trump, suddenly he's the worst thing ever, and they have to call him out every single time. They would never call Joe Biden out, for lying, because, they have no values other than Democrats good, Republicans bad. Next we have RFK Jr., who doesn't have a medical degree, says he can diagnose children just by looking at them, from independent.co.uk, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, if he wants to think he can diagnose what people with whatever he wants to, that's fine. I personally can see, in some you can tell for some people if they have something mental going on just by looking at them. I agree with that. But and probably physical as well in some instances, like if they're in a wheelchair. But ultimately, if he wants to think he's a doctor, I personally am very much against licensing of any kind. That includes medical licenses. And so, if you want to diagnose someone with something, justify you doing whatever you want to. I personally think a diagnosis, should be more. I personally seek a professional opinion. But if you don't want a professional opinion with someone found and go to someone found a medical degree instead, you 100% should be able to do so. The next we have Section 22.13.13, Kingly Bonfires, DC Law Library. If you're going to publicly burn the American flag in DC, you might want to do it during daylight hours, lest you be fined $10, from code.dccouncil.gov, posted by DMBFFF. And yeah, that's cross post from the law subreddit. And yeah, it just goes to show you, the nanny state isn't just just the Republicans, it's the Democrats as well. The DC is pretty much exclusively controlled by the Democrats and has never cast its electoral votes for a Republican candidate ever since it started getting in 1960. But regardless, they still can very much nanny state you. If you try and burn the American flag, you might get arrested for kindling bonfires, as they say. So it just goes to show you that, the Democrats and the Republicans, they might market themselves as very different, but they're really two sides of the same shit coin who want to push you around and tell you what to do. Even if, Reddit might market them as extremely different, they're pretty much the same thing. Maybe they'll have some performative differences, like in regards to sending the National Guard in cities, but other than that, they're pretty much the exact same thing. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.